So, Pankaj, are we good to go live?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So good afternoon, folks, and welcome to Marcellus's webinar with a very special lady, Namrita Jhangiani. I've known her for the best part of now more than a decade, actually. Now 12 years I've known Namrita, and she's going to help us discuss how India's greatest companies build strong boards. Namrita is the head of financial services at Egon Zehnder. Welcome to Marcellus's webinar, Namrita. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Saurabh and Salil. Thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to an interesting 1 hour.
Fantastic. So folks, the usual format, I'll introduce Namrita. We'll have a discussion around some of the sort of key topics that we as investors think about when we think about strong board. Then at the half an hour mark, at the halfway point of this hour, we'll start taking your questions. So the more questions, some of you are really quick off the mark, some of the questions are already in. So the more questions you put into the Q&A box, the more likely Salil is to curate and take one of your questions and point it towards Namrita. So let me do a bit of an introduction to get things going. So Namrita works for Egon Zehnder. They're a leading global leadership advisory firm. So they help organizations in executive search, CEO search, and a subject which is of huge interest to us, succession planning. Egon Zehnder helps companies with succession planning. They also, and that's going to be the big focus of our discussion today, Egon helps companies build the best board of directors possible, right? You must have heard us say on hundreds of webinars that a high quality company has to have a high quality board of directors, right? Namrita is the global leadership team, is part of the global leadership team at Egon Zehnder's financial services practice. She co-leads the firm's diversity and inclusion practice in India. Previously, she was the leader of the financial services practice of Egon Zehnder in Asia and India, right? And over the last decade, we've had several very interesting discussions with Namrita on how strong banks in India build high quality boards of directors. She advises her clients not just on governance and leadership succession. She's also advising clients on the rapidly evolving area of ESG, and perhaps we'll have some time today to discuss developments in that area because ESG is rapidly becoming a big focus for investors. In terms of educational qualifications, she has a bachelor's in economics from St. Xavier's College in Mumbai and an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. So very impressive lady, and a lady who's helped me learn a lot about financial services in India. So Namrita, I'll begin with perhaps the question you get asked the most often, but a question nevertheless that we still haven't quite figured out, which is what exactly is a strong board, right? We keep hearing these days, it's a euphemism almost, that a company needs to have a strong board, but what exactly is a strong board?
Thanks, Saurabh. A strong board actually is a board that's fit for purpose, right? So there's a board for company A, which is a very strong board, may actually not be such a strong board for company B. It depends on where is the company in its evolution, what is the ownership, what is the strategy. So what is a strong board is, at one side, you can have a board that keeps the companies from making mistakes. They focus on compliance, they focus on risk, they limit the downside. And that's a strong board for some companies at some period of time of their existence. On the other spectrum, you have companies and board directors that help the company maximize where they can go, how far they can grow, where can they go, and how can they take their share price up, how can they make the company a more valuable, long-term sustainable organization. So, and what is the right board and the best board could be anywhere on that spectrum from left to right. Right. Depending on where the company is and what the strategy is.
So let me get this right. So if you say if a company has, say, $1 billion market cap, what constitutes a strong board for them is very different from a company which is, say, $100 billion market cap.
That's true. And also if a company is highly regulated and or if a company is not regulated, again, what the board, where the board can play will vary, and what the board does really well will vary. So absolutely true.
Right. So if you now sort of, if you help us now join this with the point that we get asked a lot. So, amongst our investee companies will be companies spanning that spectrum. At the smaller end of what we do, there'll be companies with market cap of say $500 million. And at the larger end will be the $100 billion giants. And typically it's the companies at the smaller end, $500 million, $2 billion, $3 billion, they ask us to suggest, good board members for them, right? And they say, can you put us in touch? So what should one look for when one is trying to get senior people to join the board of the company? What are desirable characteristics in a high quality board member?
So I will give you, so what there is, you need to have somebody who has an understanding or some domain knowledge of the company's business, one element. Now that could be, in fact, that could be one of the executive directors, but you do need someone who understands the business. Then you need to make sure that if the company is playing in a certain area and they're looking forward to strategy, who are the people who can think through that strategy and help them get there? There should be diversity of thinking. So you don't want to have, so for example, when I joined Egon Zehnder 21 years ago, when we used to work with company boards in India, board members would be largely very reputed lawyers, very reputed bankers, and very reputed chartered accountants. And I remember very early on, there was a client of mine that was in the retail business, and they wanted us to do a board search. And I said, what are you looking for? And they said, person of repute, we have bankers, lawyers, chartered accountants, and somebody like that. And I said, okay, but you're a retail business. Do you have anyone who understands a consumer? And they said, no. It was a big question mark. And I said, would you be open to considering somebody who understands the consumer and brings consumer insights? And there was a fair degree of questioning, but they said, fine. The chairman, somebody was, said, okay, let's go with that. Show us some of the lawyers and bankers and show us some of the people who understand consumers. And we brought them an advertising professional to their board. And over the years, as I talked to the CEO about their board, he said, the person who adds the most value to my thinking is this advertising professional, because I'm trying to build a retail business and he understands consumers.
Right.
So you need to find diversity. If everybody's a chartered accountant or everybody's a lawyer, there is a limited amount of range of diverse thinking that comes on. Increasingly, as the world is becoming younger and digital, we're asked to bring in technology skills. But we're asked to also, a lot of our clients are now asking us to bring on younger board members. And often people who are in their early 70s and they were used to a club are now realizing that the diversity of thinking by bringing in younger board members, multiple women, so not the one woman who puts in for regulation, but bringing multiple women to bring in diversity increases their discussions and debates on the board, which is what makes a good board.
Right.
So you need some skill sets and diversity. Then you need to have a board. A good board is a board that works really well as a team. So you bring in individuals for domain competence, knowledge of consumer and marketing, technology, finance and audit. So you bring in people for some domain, but they have to work together in a very congenial fashion and recognize that while they come onto the board for their domain, they are then a board member for the company and not for their domain. So if they come in with a background in technology, they don't then ignore something if there's something going on in the audit, and they don't ignore it. They actively contribute and ask questions. And actually, because you come from one domain and perhaps you're not so good at the other one, you ask more questions, which is what a good board should do, right? And they should work well together. I think it's important that board members can disagree without being disagreeable, because that fosters debate, and debate fosters good discussions. So it's very important that they work well as a team, but can challenge each other.
So let me now put to you something that I heard a lot when I migrated to India 14 years ago. So I'll take a different subject, but a related subject. So first few years in India, when we used to do forensic accounting and focus on accounting as a measure of corporate governance, a lot of people told me that, look, this sort of thing, it's very good in London and New York, but in India, this sort of accounting thing is kind of, it's very, very theoretical. In India, we like investing in promoters who are sort of, men of iron, men of steel, and men who will go and conquer the world tomorrow morning. So, keep this theoretical knowledge to yourself, sort of, focus on dhandebaz promoters, right? And I'm sure you often get this in India. The people will say, diversity, variety of perspectives, congenial discussions, that sort of thing, Namrita. London, New York, perhaps Singapore, but in India, we just want to get on with it and make a lot of money. And from your perspective, right, how does one how does one rationalize this and say that indeed boards which are diverse, which have high quality board members, do go on to become more successful? Is there a way to look at this practically rather than idealistically?
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of research on this. Both at the board and the executive level, diversity increases valuations, it increases good decisions.
Right.
And so definitely, so when you say bring on men on steel versus bring on diversity, and then we get into the women debate of diversity. So that's a evident, visible part of diversity.
Sure.
And you bring on one woman in a board of 12 steely men, then perhaps that diversity doesn't add a huge amount of value, because that one woman in 12 steely men, it can be a bit of a challenge initially to make your voice heard. Over time, women do. But if you say, I want a truly diverse board and make it truly diverse, bring in, a sizable number of gender diversity, bring on different age groups, bring on people from different backgrounds. It's not a friends and family first board. You will find those boards have much more enriching and encouraging discussions. And I think they do get higher valuations and higher performance.
Very interesting.
And I've seen that evolve a lot over the years. And there are some boards where the chairman or the promoter will define who he brings on the board. And everybody's happy to say yes to each other. They don't ask such difficult questions because the promoter has brought them on board. They are good friends. They feel a little bit beholden. That may not be the best board in the world.
Very interesting.
Right. So I said you have to disagree without being disagreeable. And if you don't disagree, then you may not be as effective in your role as you should be.
So what you're saying will be music to the ears of my colleague Salil Desai. He's been a big champion within Marcellus that we need to have more diversity, and I think Salil is winning that battle. We'll discuss in a subsequent webinar one day, Salil Desai and the triumph of diversity in Marcellus. You mentioned the skills that board members need, right? That in the India of 30 years ago, lawyers, accountants, people who could help a company deal with the regulatory ecosystem were very desirable. And you mentioned that tech savvy board members have become more desirable. If you were to look at say the last 3-4 years, what are the most frequently demanded skill sets by high quality Indian boards today? What are they coming to you and say, these are the 3 things I really need, Namrita, badly?
Technology. The world is becoming so digital, and regardless of who you are and what you do, and sometimes I get astonished that because I'm not a technology person, and my knowledge of technology is emerging, I would say, rather than extensive. So when some companies talk about how technology helps them, it makes me think quite hard. But technology is all pervasive. So every company is now looking at how they can get good digital technology skills on their board to advise them on how to go forward. And it doesn't matter which industry you're in. Marketing is becoming quite important. Accounting and audit has always been important, and it's obviously mandatory always, but marketing, technology, HR is becoming quite important as companies are focusing on the role of the NRC. And they will either look for good general management skills, so a CEO, retired CEO, or a non-conflicted CEO, or a really good HR talent professional. Very important, because companies recognize that the only thing they have to differentiate between a competitor and themselves is their human capital.
I think Arundhati Bhattacharya gave an interview to the Financial Times yesterday. She's now running Salesforce. Arundhati Bhattacharya said that India is facing a skills crisis.
Yes.
Any country, if you have skills at a premium, then obviously HR becomes a critical aspect for the board to consider. Now, if we were to sort of step back and say, it's all very well that Marcellus invests in the listed world, but the country is changing. Companies funded by private equity and venture capital are increasingly visible. They're part of our day-to-day lives, especially in the context of tech. Many of them are going public. If you were to look at private equity and venture capital, that constituency, are they taking a very different stance on board constitution? And if so, how are they diverging? How are they deviating from the established listed company board practices?
I think private equity and venture capital are they're a little bit more here and now. So they say, okay, we want to exit in 5 years. We either want to exit through an IPO, most likely through an IPO, Obviously, they may do strategic sales, but that's what they look at. So they try and create a board where everybody can contribute. And depending on the portfolio company, so they may bring on a good retired CFO to be on the audit committee, but maybe that retired CFO can also be a mentor to the CFO of the portfolio company. They will. We were working with a company that's in the sort of e-commerce space right now, and they asked us to help them bring on 2 logistics experts from global companies who could bring them the best of logistics thinking, because they are evolving in this space. We work with a private equity backed pharma company. Now, the private equity firm recognized that they were not experts in pharma, but they are looking at 5-year exit. So they want to bring on the best pharma thinking. So we brought them on their board, a retired pharma MD who spent his 40 years in his career in the pharma world as to chair their board. So you see private equity being very focused on what value they can get from their board members, and then going out and seeking people for those skills.
Right.
Whereas I think more, larger publicly traded boards are still evolving on that journey.
Very interesting. So in a way, you're saying private equity, ironically, is that much more focused on making the board sweat, making the board sweat and getting value out of the board.
Yeah, in a different way. It's not that bigger companies don't get value out of their board, but they have a slightly different horizon, right? If you're running in a large company, if you're a board member, and it's a large listed entity, they're looking at a board member coming on for 10 years. And how are they going to contribute for 10 years, right, over 2 terms? Private equity has got a slightly shorter horizon. So it's a different way of getting value out of your board.
Right. So I think it's actually a very interesting area for listed market professionals like us, that if the quality of a board drives shareholder value creation, and Namrita is referencing quantitative work, which does show that the quality of your board has a direct bearing on how much shareholder value you create, it necessarily logically follows that listed market investors like ourselves have to be more proactive in amping up the quality of the board. I think it's a subject we'll come on to in years to come. Now, Namrita, I was reading an Egon Zehnder paper. I'll just quickly project it on the screen. I was reading an Egon Zehnder paper on CEO succession, right? And whilst I'd read this a couple of years ago, there was something I saw in this chart that made me fall off my chair. Right, what you guys have shown in this chart is CEO succession, which obviously is a massive issue for public market investors like us. You've shown in this chart using a bunch of companies, bunch of countries, China, America, the UK, Germany, France. Basically, this chart is telling me that a typical CEO lasts for, say, 5 years. Right? Yeah. Typical CEO seems to last for 5 years, right? And whilst I would love to believe that the number in India is higher, something tells me that actually that number is relevant for India as well. A typical CEO, the life of a CEO is increasingly short because of the demands of the job, the speed at which economies are evolving. And therefore, CEO succession becomes a massive issue for listed market investors like us. What is the link between a good board and CEO succession? Are they distinct issues, or are they...
Right. Huge linkage. So a good quality board starts preparing for CEO succession the day they appoint a new CEO. I mean, they really should.
Right.
Boards, you never know when you have a crisis situation, which could be either you ask your CEO to go, or it could be that the CEO falls ill, or the CEO is hit by a bus. You never know what situation could hit you. So a good board should always have in their back pocket an active list of CEO succession candidates, which could be internal or external. It doesn't mean that you're talking to external candidates every day and making the incumbent CEO feel insecure that he or she is going to be asked to go any day. Absolutely not. But if you're thinking about downside risk and you're suddenly hit by a bus, you need to know that you can appoint a CEO in quick order. And so a good board will think about CEO succession all the time. And it's not just CEO succession, actually, it should be leadership succession across the board, the next level down and maybe 2 levels down, depending on the size of the company. And sometimes we see companies that do it for real. So we've worked with companies where every year, and these are huge companies, so this is not necessary for everybody, but for huge companies, every year they will ask us to do a market map and say, who are the 5 people who should be on our speed dial should we need it?
Wow.
They may not meet those people, They may not call those people, but they want to know for the size of their company, who are the 5 people they should know. And those names don't change year on year, but every year, 1 or 2 may drop off, 1 or 2 may get added on, and somebody will be constant. And that's what a good company should do.
And just to be clear, these 5 people, the chairman will keep those names, or the head of the NRC board director, the nomination?
Yeah, right. Normally the NRC board director, but often the chairman. The other thing they will do is they will look internally, because you don't want to be going out externally for research, right? You want to, ideally, you should be promoting from within. So they should look at internally, who are our best 3 or 4 candidates or 5 candidates. We've appointed a new CEO today. Hopefully the new CEO will run through till 10 years. So if you have 5 candidates today, maybe some may leave, some may retire, some may no longer not develop. But you're saying, okay, these are the 5 people I will run with as internal candidates for the CEO job. And what can I do between today and whichever day I need to appoint them to develop them, so that on the day I need to develop them, I need to appoint them, they are as developed as they could be without being in the job.
Right.
So you need to actively manage your talent to say that you always have an internal pool and you always have an eye to the external market to say who's the best person.
Right. So one of the preconceptions I had was that headhunter's job is to basically go and pick people and put them in front of the board and say, here's some CEO candidates. You're saying the headhunter's job is as much preparation for succession planning as it is the specific event of succession planning.
I will say my job,
right,
as a search firm and leadership development firm,
right,
is that. So we tell our clients that if your internal candidates are 80% as good as the external candidates, go internal. We actively promote internal candidates,
right,
if they have the capability, and we actively promote them. We coach them, or so we don't think our job in search ends the day somebody is appointed. We think our job ends about a year after they've been appointed, because we made sure they're successful in their role. Now, this could be internal or external.
Right.
And for that year, we will work with them to make them successful in their role. And I think a good firm should not distinguish between external and internal, because we want to do what's best for the company. And if the internal is 80-85% as good as external, then they know the market, they know the company, they know the people, they know some of the challenges. It's always safer to go internal, right? When you're going external, there's always some part that you don't know, and you're finding out.
So this is again a subject that's of huge interest to us, because we've also found that companies that have proven themselves on succession planning over the last 20-30 years go on to deliver significantly more wealth for our clients than companies who sort of react at the last moment, right?
Yeah.
But one of the areas of pushback that we get from companies is that, look, it's all very good for you guys to make these theoretical points about succession planning and internal succession. The promoter often tells us the last thing I want to do is get some sort of board, succession battle going on in my firm, where my most talented people are at each other's throats. And it's almost presented to us that there's some sort of tension between getting internal people groomed for the top job and reacting at the last moment, right? And reacting at the last moment seems still to be the preferred course of action for many companies. What exactly is the reality? Is trying to create internal succession a recipe for corporate politics, or is trying to create internal succession the way to run an enlightened company?
I think you should, whatever you're doing, you should be developing your leadership team, right? Your leadership team is this. No one can do a job alone. So no star CEO can do the job without a whole lot of people behind him or her. So you should be developing your people, and hopefully, as you're developing them, you're making them internal candidates. I don't think you should be creating a political game and saying, you three will be one of you three will win and 2 of you will lose.
Right.
That's where the politics are created. But if you're developing everybody all the time, hopefully you're also achieving your objective.
Right. It's like those TV shows, right? A guy became a US president by doing that on TV show. He became so famous, he went on to run the United States. So you're saying we shouldn't do that. That's not the way a succession battle runs, that you are fired.
Correct.
There's a different...
It shouldn't be a game of winners and losers, right? It should be a game where the whole company floats up.
In fact, I think this is probably an area where we need to also understand, because especially for smaller companies who are for the first time hitting $1 billion market cap, $2 billion market cap, it's a completely new world. And many of the companies where, say, the market cap is $3 billion, we turn around to them and say, look, you'll be a decade hence, you'll be $30 billion market cap. So prepare now. And they almost look bewildered at that point, saying, how on earth are we supposed to prepare?
And Saurabh, there are times when you need to go out and do search, because the CEO who's fit for purpose for a company that maybe started small and became $1 billion is perhaps not the CEO to run a $30 billion or $100 billion company, right? And there are times that you cannot do development, because if you're growing this way, sometimes you actually need that fresh injection from outside. So there is a reason why firms like us exist.
Right.
And it's not always that you should promote internally. There are times when you just need somebody of the right size, skill, and caliber to take your company to the next leadership role. And if you see a lot of companies, a lot of the startups, you see a certain CEO who takes it from startup, the founder, to a certain size and scale. And then you see some professional come in, because there are different skills you need at different times of a company size and scale.
Sure. So folks, keep putting your questions in the Q&A box. At the half an hour mark, Salil will take your questions.
I'm astonished. I see 13 questions already.
I think it'll build up. So let's go into the topic which I think every institutional client we have is putting to us, and a topic where Salil is the practice leader in Marcellus, which is ESG. Right, so we're being asked by our investee companies not only make sure that the companies we invest are clean from an accounting perspective, we're also being asked to increasingly make sure these companies don't go and throw tons of chemicals into the river, abuse human rights. We're also being asked to make sure these companies are doing the right thing from a social perspective, right? So ESG is a complicated area. It's an evolving area. I don't think we in Marcellus will claim it's a subject matter of expertise, but clearly it's an area where there is enormous amount of investor interest. This is not just overseas investor interest. Some of the family offices for whom we manage money in India are very clear that if you guys invest money in companies which are naughty companies, we will take a dim view of that, even if you make a lot of money for us. So in this context, from your perspective as a search firm, what is the board's role? Is the board supposed to be the custodian of ESG practices, or is the promoter, so to speak, the custodian?
I think the management, which could be promoter or not, should be making sure that ESG is top of mind. But it is the board's role to make sure that the company is following those practices, is thinking about it. And ESG is really broad, because there's environmental, there's social, and then there's governance. And they actually are not always the same. They're not necessarily a unified bucket.
Right.
So I think it's important for the management team to make sure that they're actively working on all of those dimensions, and for the board to say, to question, to ask, to help them to drive the strategy, to help them keep developing. And it's a growing area, and we see a lot of discussion. I think particularly it's picked up during COVID and after COVID, much more discussion than there was before. We see more companies becoming certified as B Corps. In fact, Egon Zehnder is on that B Corp journey itself. And we see more of our clients asking us, for example, as us, but other sort of partners that they work with, to say, what are you all doing on ESG? What are you all doing on your area? So that more and more companies are asking their partners about what their practices are, and they're trying to develop some of those practices internally. But I would say it's a very evolving area. I think we're all very early in our journey. Right. India is earlier in its journey than the US, perhaps, or in some of the other markets, perhaps. But it is rapidly evolving.
So I think at that juncture, I'll hand over to Salil. But before I do so, I'll give you my an ESG anecdote from within Marcellus. So, like many other firms, right, in our meeting rooms, we have these bottles of plastic bottles of water, and some of our research meetings tend to go on for 5-6 hours, and many of us drink 3 or 4, perhaps 5 bottles of water. So one of our bright young recruits chastised us a couple of months ago. This 22-year-old young man, he said, it's all very well you guys talk about ESG, but by the time the meeting is done, there are 30 plastic bottles in the room. And we were so hugely embarrassed after that since then, I now bring my water bottle to the office. And ESG is gradually seeping into my psyche. A long way for us to go, but it was very right. It was an appropriate point he made, that it's all very good to talk the walk, but walking the talk is a world we need to get into soon.
Absolutely. And it's been very interesting to see for the last, I think, just pre-COVID, so maybe 6 months or a year before COVID, as you'd walk into corporate offices, you'd start seeing glass bottles and glasses rather than the plastic bottles, which is fantastic.
So Salil, over to you. And folks keep putting questions there. Salil will take them and put them to Namrita.
Right. I think it's been a great discussion so far. I myself have a lot of questions and will prioritize the people on the call. So Namrita, the first, there are two related questions. One is from Hemant Mishra and one is from Neerav Shah. They're essentially asking is, what advice would you give startup founders in terms of building a board? Right? Does the drive of the founder really carry the company to a certain level, like you were mentioned earlier? Or do they need to start about thinking of a board much early on? And related to that is at what time in a private company's life, not a listed company, a private company, at what time should they really start seriously thinking about an effective board?
See, I think, why do you bring on a board? You bring on a board to help the management team stretch its thinking. You bring on a board to help. So I'm talking now about unlisted, so no compliance. So assuming there's no compliance and regulatory, which I assume there isn't for a non-listed company, then you're bringing on a board for how can they stretch your thinking. You can ask them to help you make decisions. You can perhaps ask them to help you not make decisions, right? Where you're making a bad decision. So it's never too early to bring on independent thinkers who can advise the management team on what they're doing. It's never too early. It doesn't have to be for listing. Obviously, if you're going to get listed, we see companies calling us 6 months or 1 year before their planned IPO to say, help us reconstitute our board or constitute our board. But why should you have to wait for that? If you're looking for a board to add value to your thinking, you can do it the day you start up.
Right. That should answer the questions of Hemant and Leo. Right. The next question is from Malhar Manek, and he asks that there are cases where there are executives of a certain company, it's a CEO of one company, in an executive role, being on the board or being an independent director on the board of some other company. They might be unrelated businesses, so there's direct conflict of interest. But is this a good practice? Something's already with a certain company. How does
I think if the CEO is not on 100 other companies, but on one or maybe two, you bring in new thinking, right? You think about how you run your company, but you look at how somebody else is running their company as a board member, and you learn from those experiences and bring that learning into your own company. So I think there's nothing wrong if you have the time and ability to do so, to take on one or maybe two. I wouldn't say more than that, because if you're in an executive role, you can't really do much more than that. But certainly you should do that because it really helps you in your own thinking. It stretches your thinking and your learning, which you can bring to your own company.
And maybe add some diversity by way of somebody who's coming from a different business. Right? Great. The next question really is about how do you assess or how do you measure the effectiveness of a board? Because this seems a more qualitative subject, right?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I missed your question.
Sorry. So the question is that how does one assess the effectiveness of a board? Right. This is largely a qualitative subject. So is there some way? A lot of us or the investors want quantitative measures to
so
assess everything, right?
We do this all the time. So it's part of our service, and we do this for a living. I would say there are three ways that we assess the board. We break it up into three. We say who's on the board, what do they discuss, and how do they behave, right? So we break it into three buckets: the what, the who, the what, the how. Mm-hmm. So the who's on the board, are your board directors fit for purpose? Do they bring diversity of thinking? Do they bring domain knowledge? Do they stretch the thinking of the management team? Do they represent the geographies in which you work? Do they represent the age groups that you target? Do they represent the sort of customers you target, right? So do you have a sort of fairly comprehensive board? Is there enough independence? So do you have a fairly, so it's the who. The next is the what. So what goes on the agenda? Is it full of regulatory issues? Is there matters of strategic importance being discussed? Is there areas of risk being discussed? Is talent management, talent development, succession planning being discussed? So what's on the agenda? And finally, it's the how. So how do they work together? Are they one team? So they may come in from very diverse areas, and you do want them to come from diverse areas, but then they should be one team. Do they meet pre and post board meetings? Do they meet without the management team there? Do they meet without the promoter there? Do the independents meet separately? So what do they how do they discuss? Do they disagree without being disagreeable? Or is it all just groupthink? So those are the various areas that we measure boards on, and we can give you a pretty precise measurement, not in numbers, but we look at boards and we say, this is what you're doing really well, and we give you a green signal for that. And this is where you're doing some things quite well, but there's an area for improvement. We give you a yellow signal for that. And this is the areas which you're not doing well at all, and this is what you need to focus on. We give you a red signal for that.
So I'll just chime in here. So I can just sort of validate this firsthand. So a few years ago, I was part of a group of people who were assessed by Namrita and her colleagues, and it's extremely rigorous. There's a variety of tests you have to go through, psychometric tests, personality tests, and then there are sort of long discussions, quite demanding discussions on subjects around decision making, leadership, collegiality, and so on. I remember by the end of it, I sort of felt I needed a small holiday. So it might sound touchy-feely, but it's extremely rigorous, and that's when I first realized, this was 5 or 6 years ago, the value of a group of senior professionals being subjected to rigor of this sort. It was a novel experience for me, and the sheer rigor of it was enormous. And I can fully understand why Namrita is saying, if you assess a group of people like that, as rigorously as that, you can end up with a pretty good judgment on the quality and the ability of that group of people to drive a business successfully. Salil, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. Srini Reddy asks, what should be the churn rate for board members?
Sorry, what should be
the churn rate, in the sense, what should be a typical tenure? How many times should you rotate board members, and so
on? So there should be a term, because after a while, independent directors stop being independent and thinking, because they've been with the company for too long. So the SEBI currently will nominate 2 terms of 5 years each. I would say that's a maximum. It could be 8 years, because the first couple of years you're really learning before you really get into your flow, and then the last few years perhaps you could use some fresh thinking. When we advise our clients, we advise them to have evergreen boards. So evergreen boards doesn't mean that everybody comes on in year 1 and then after 10 years everybody leaves, but we advocate that 1/3 of the board should turn over every 3 years or so that at any point of time you have some young board members, you have some more experienced board members, and you have some in the middle, and that would constitute an ideal board from my perspective.
Right. Switching gears to succession, CEO succession. Right now, in many companies, we might see that there are 2 or 3 first among equals or equally qualified candidates, and eventually just one person is chosen for the job. In your experience, have you dealt with those who eventually didn't make it to the top?
Yes.
And how can a company or a board deal with them, make sure they're secure, continue, because they're valuable people, right?
Yeah, and so I think it's important for both the board that did not select, say, candidate B and candidate C, as well as the CEO, make sure that candidate B and candidate C feel valued and respected. And we've seen many successful examples where candidate B and candidate C, who did not make it out of the internal candidates and candidate A did, and it doesn't matter candidate A is actually external or internal, but your candidate B and C who were internals did not make it, that they have stayed on, and they've stayed on, contributed, been promoted, and been very successful. So I think it's important. I go back to behaviors. Does the CEO make the two candidates or whichever number of candidates feel that they are valued? Do they seek their counsel? And does the board make those people feel valued and part of the team?
Right. Okay.
And I've seen it work successfully. I've seen it work not so successfully.
So what we're getting is that when you're selecting the CEO or when you're recommending who the CEO should be, you're also looking at qualitative factors that this person will continue to work with the people who are not selected. So that's one of the selection criteria itself, the maturity of the person who's
so when we're looking for the CEO, we're looking for a number of factors. And one is definitely how he or she will work with the team, right? You may need to actually change the team below, given the particular circumstances, but whoever the CEO is needs to work with the team, whether it's the same team or a different team, depending on the circumstance. Yes, we do look at that. And one of my clients with whom I'm working currently, and I hear this every day for the last week, which is why I'm saying it. He said a CEO is like the conductor of an orchestra. The orchestra is the entire management team, and the CEO is a conductor. And we need a really good conductor who can make everyone of the orchestra play their best music.
Right. That's interesting. Ashwin Bajaj has a question on board compensation. Is there a right way to go about deciding what that should be? And in India, we see disparities in terms of some companies pay the board members really well, some companies just pay nominal amounts. So is there a way to really get this number right?
I think as board members are expected to spend a lot more time on the board, they should be compensated for their time. What tends to happen is if they are paid not very highly, and if they have other demands on their time, they may not give the adequate amount of time to this board. That being said, I don't think any company should hire a board member for the fee they pay, because if they do, chances are that board member will not be independent. They'll be more interested in the fee that they're taking home and may not be asking the questions they need to ask. So I don't think the fee should be the reason why a board member joins, but for the amount of time they spend and are expected increasingly to spend, they should be compensated for their time. And I can't give you a precise figure because, again, it will vary by company and situation.
So for those who are listening, if you want some sort of ballpark, roughly what we see, and so for our small cap companies, so say little champs companies, the independents tend to get paid around 10 to 15 lakhs, right? And even say companies with market caps of $1 billion, $2 billion, I've seen 10 to 15 lakhs being the independent directors' remuneration. Once you get into the market cap range of say around 5 to 10 billion, the independent directors' compensation is around say 30-35 lakhs. And then once you're punching through to say $30-40 billion, the independents can be earning 40-50 lakhs. That's the sort of the sorts of companies we invest in. We've seen that sort of span, that the upper end, a 30-40-50 billion dollar company will have board compensation in the vicinity of 40-50 lakhs a year. Salil?
Right. The next question, Namrita, is from Shrikant Jaikumar, and his question is around evaluating the performance of the board. So you have got each board member for a specific skill, like you were mentioning. Now, how do you go about measuring that they're contributing what you expected them to?
So as I mentioned, we do evaluate boards frequently, and you want to evaluate the board member for do they read the board documents before? Do they come prepared? Do they contribute at board meetings? Do they feel that they are, let's say, for argument's sake, if they are brought on because of their technology skills, do they only open their mouth when it comes to a technology issue? Or do they feel that they are board members for the entire company and therefore contribute actively across whatever discussion is going on. Are they disagreeable, or are they trying? Do they contribute in a congenial way? Do they? Yeah, I think those are the main areas of it. So if a board member is very silent unless they talk on their domain, they probably don't feel like a full board member. If the board member is very disagreeable and always changes the dynamics on the board, that's not really a very congenial board member to have. If it's a chair, which is the most important role, and the chair speaks first, then often the rest of the board will not contribute adequately. So, you need to make sure that every board member has a voice and shares their voice. And they should do it in an effective way.
So there's a particularly delicious question. If you don't mind, I'll just take that. So unfortunately, the person hasn't named himself or herself. So Namrita, you don't have to name any companies, given the sensitivities of the very difficult, very challenging job that you do. But whoever's asked this question has figured out that some of the highest profile search mandates over the last decade, Namrita has been responsible for that. So just focusing on one sector, right? CEO searches for banks, are they different from CEO searches for the rest of the world?
Yes, they are. So CEO searches for banks, we have a regulator, right? And that creates a level of complexity that you need to think about, because in India, the regulator wants more than one name. They want two names. Until about a year and a half ago, they used to want three names. And when you have to go to the regulator with three names, sometimes these leak, and you can ruin some person 2 and person 3's careers when that happens. So they have that complexity. Because there's a regulator, there's a timing. So it's not you don't make a decision, go to the stock market and go to AGM right away. It could be lying in limbo for the regulator to approve. So that there's a timing angle to it. And then there is the angle that perhaps the regulator doesn't find who you've selected appropriate. Right. And then you have to start from scratch. So there is complexity in that for sure. And then there are further complexities about banking, which is about the business, which is probably not too much detail to go into here.
Sure. So Salil, back to you.
Thanks. Namrita, one question is on diversity versus competency. Now, is there ever a need to balance these two? Can you have these conflicting objectives? Should we prioritize one over the other? Or is there a way to get both?
I mean, I think you should not bring on anyone onto your board who's not competent. But I don't think, and I don't know which area of diversity, but if you talk about diversity of gender, I think you can find enough competent people of either gender, right? If you're looking at diversity of age, then you have to think about why are you looking for that diversity of age. And if your target customer is 20-something, then having a 20-year-old who may not understand some of the other business complexities, but understands your target customer may provide value. So what is competent, I think, is a debate for the particular circumstance. But I have never faced a situation where we're trying to create a diverse board that we can't find people of the competence we want. It all depends on what you define as competence and how open you are in your mind about both competence and diversity.
Right. Since we're talking of diversity and say gender diversity in particular, right? So one question is, the person is quoting the finance minister. I'm not sure if that is what she said, but apparently she says that women are not not willing to be directors on boards of companies. So if we look at the broader area of having more women directors on boards, so one is regulation is restricted to one. Beyond that, how are you seeing the mindset of Indian CEOs or Indian boards bring in more women directors?
If the question is, are women willing to be board members of companies? I would say it depends, as it would depend on men. There are men I will ask for boards and they say, no, I'll take an advisory role, but I won't take a board role because there's too much risk. So I think it depends. I don't think that's gender specific. I think it's a person's willingness to go on a board with all of the attached risks or not. Are CEOs ready for, did you see, are CEOs willing to take on board?
I mean, how is the mindset now? Apart from regulation, is there awareness or people appreciate the fact that
I think it's evolving.
Okay.
There are some, and you are masters at this, both of you, because you track this, but when SEBI made their rule, there were some companies that had women directors before SEBI made it mandatory. When SEBI made it mandatory, some companies put on their wives or mothers or sisters.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with actually having wives or mothers or sisters if they bring a certain degree of competence for that board. There's nothing wrong with the fact that they're a relation. But you need to know that they're bringing on whatever you're looking for in terms of competence. And then there are companies that today, having had one and then two board members who are women, are actually now saying, let's get 50% of our board women. And you do see companies of that ilk. So I think it all depends. It's an evolving mindset. It's an evolving rule, and it's an evolving mindset. There are some who say, we're really trying to find women board members and there are none. I question that. There are others who are 50% women board members and they don't have an issue. So it all depends on the mindset, I guess.
As long as we're progressing in the right direction.
Yeah, no, yeah. I do feel we are.
Okay. So now, there are a couple of questions on conflicts within the board, particularly between the CEO, right, or a founder, a founder who might be very individualistic in terms of how they started business out and built it. So one is, how active should the board be? Is one part. And second, is it if there is a founder who's kind of at cross purposes or is in some sort of conflict, then what's the best way to resolve this?
Yeah. So if you'd like, I can put up a slide which will show you what is the role of the board and what is the role here. It's not a founder. What is the role of the management? Can you see this? And then I'll answer your question.
Yes, we can see this.
So the role of the board is to govern and the role of the management is to manage. And they are two distinct and different roles. So I'm going to take this off now and then we can talk about the founder you were mentioning. The board needs to realize it is not management. And the board needs to respect that the founder, I'm presuming the founder is the CEO or the management team, is running the company, right? Equally, the founder should be respectful of, what is the board trying to do? If the board is trying to give good advice, the board is giving good strategy, there is merit to taking that. But should they be at conflict? No. I mean, I think each one needs to respect the other. I hope I've answered your question right. I'm not sure if I got the right question.
I think you've given us what we need. If basically there is tension, conflict between the board and the founder, it's not a ship going in the right direction.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Now here's a different question again from Hemant Mishra, and he says, "What should one do? How should one kind of develop themselves if they aspire to be on the board of a company sometime? So, what would you look for in an individual, and how can people prepare for being selected as a board member?"
So I think you need to think about how what is the company going to do and how can you contribute as a board member. So I think you should understand how to read financial statements, for example. You should understand the company's business, for example. So those are sort of I would call sort of basic table stakes. And then more importantly, you should make sure you have the time, you give it the energy, the passion. You express your views independently. You think of the company and don't just think of yourself as a domain specialist, because when you're a board member, you're a board member for the company. And I think there are now a few sort of exams you can pass where you can learn about how to be a board member through some of the financial things that you need to do. And I think you should do that.
So just on that, the Institute of Directors, they run a course. Anybody can attend that, and it's quite a useful course. When we began Marcellus, we didn't have the money to have any other board directors, so since we had to go in. I remember going to Pune for a couple of days too, and it's there's quite a bit of regulation now to get your heads around.
Namrita, next question is on, how, or let's say, what would your views be on minority shareholders holding the board directly accountable? Should there be a mechanism in place where the board members are questioned directly by minority shareholders, or any way where, if people are worried or there's something wrong going on, who can question the board itself?
I mean, I think the board should be always accountable. If you're asking about the process by which minority shareholders can hold the board accountable, independent directors actually are appointed on behalf of the minority shareholders, right? So they should be accountable to the minority shareholders. I don't necessarily believe that bringing an activist into the board and creating sort of dynamics that are not productive is in the interest of either the majority or the minority shareholder, right? You need to do it in a way that while your minority shareholders are being protected, the whole company isn't sort of going to go down the tubes, because then even the minority shareholders suffers.
Right. There's another interesting question. This is from Girish Varagadkar. He has observed that there are many board members whose only job seems to be on boards of companies. Right now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Obviously, they bring experience of being on many different companies, knowing how they work. So is there value in having?
There's a limitation of seven listed boards, right? And then you can of course be on unlisted boards. And even that has a number. I think if somebody has had a very productive career and then they retire at, I don't know, age 60, which is the common retirement age in India. At 60, you don't really feel very old. Today, 60 is some would say the new 30, and I'm approaching there in a few years. So I certainly feel it. So when you feel 30 and you actually are 60, you have a lot of energy, and you also have 40 odd years or 35 odd years of experience and wisdom that you can share. So I don't think there's anything wrong. So long as you do your job well, you should not be on so many boards that you can't pay attention to the boards that you're on, that you're too busy with one board that you can't be active and contributing on the other. Then I think you are overplaying. But if you have enough energy and if you have the time and if you have the inclination, then I think there's a lot of wisdom that you can, from the experience that you've had over 35 years of work, but also from the boards that you're on for maybe the next 10 years, where you can cross-fertilize. But you do need to spend enough time. I think if you don't spend enough time, even if you're on one board, that's not right.
Just to be clear, Namrita, then for a listed entity, if you assume 5 board meetings and then pre-reading prep work, so for a high intensity independent director, becoming an independent director on the board of a listed entity over, so is it 15 days of time commitment a year? Is it 20 days or?
Yeah, so let's assume if it's 5 board meetings, it's also committee meetings. So it's about 2 days. Okay. 2 days per board session, right? So let's say in that case, it's 10 days plus reading material, another 5 to 7 days.
Right.
Plus, if you're a really involved board director, you might you don't just come into a meeting and leave in the meeting and then you forget about them for the next quarter, right? You might be accessible to the CEO through the period. You might be accessible to the management team. There may be an M&A going on and you have something to contribute. You might be for example, when we work with some of our clients on CEO searches, they could be spending 25 days just on that at the NRC, interviewing, meetings, deciding. So you need to be able to spend that much time. I mean, obviously the CEO searches are episodic, but certainly you should be available to the management team even in between board meetings, right? If you just go in every quarter, then perhaps you're not doing your full justice to what you can contribute.
So I'll share an anecdote on that subject before we conclude today. So there's a paint company that we made a lot of money from, and one of the things we noticed about the paint company is that around 10-11 years ago they had a new CEO, internal candidate was promoted to CEO, but that candidate wasn't the most obvious choice, right? He was actually 2 layers were skipped to give this gentleman a promotion out of turn. And the company was doing well before this internal candidate took charge. It's done spectacularly well in the last 10, 11 years. So 6 months ago, I was sitting with the promoter and asked him, what led you to promote this gentleman out of turn? And it was an inspired decision, sir. You've made a lot of money. We made a lot of money because of the energetic leadership of this very good CEO. And he said that, look, there is this independent director he had. It's a director everybody knows. I won't take the name. It's one of the sort of most unfortunate things about these discussions. It's an independent director who's appeared on Marcellus's webinars, a person we hold very dear to our hearts. This gentleman, he was the independent director 12 years ago. And as part of every round of board meetings, he would speak to 3 or 4 of the N-2s. So when the incumbent CEO is due for retirement, this independent director told the promoter is based in Delhi. He told the promoter that, look, you might want to think about this N-2 guy as the next CEO. To my mind, and this independent director is a man of huge sort of prestige, stellar track record, wise board member in every sense of the word. To my mind, this N-2 is the best candidate to lead the firm. And the promoter himself thought about it, had a chat with the N-2. I don't think they were subjected to the rigorous assessment that Namrita's firm does. And that out of turn promotion prompted by the independent director has led to said company compounding at 10x in the last 10 years. Now, some of it might have happened anyway, but even if it's 3x extra because of that return promotion, that board member's value is immense, right? And it's really the reason this sort of exercise is very valuable. So when a lot of clients tell us, P multiple kya hai, what is the latest quarter's results? The reason we de-emphasize that is the way great franchises are built is with people like Namrita working hard to build great boards, and those great boards then build billions of dollars of wealth. And that comes from this sort of rigor that we've heard over the last hour. Thank you, Namrita. This was extremely insightful. I learned a lot. You do some of the hardest things in corporate life. You guys make it look easy, but it is the stuff which changes the lives of companies and hence their employees. Thank you very much for.
Thank you so much, Saurabh. Thank you so much, Salil.
Thank you, Namrita. Pleasure talking. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks. Thanks for dialing in this evening. Wish you the very best and good night and good evening. Bye for now.